In this video, we're going to factor polynomials with 4 terms by using factoring by grouping. So, while factoring by grouping is a strategy that we use to factor when there are 4 terms, which you can see on the screen, it's also something that you've been using whether or not you realize it or not. So here, notice that we have 4 terms on the screen. 1, 2, 3, 4. And if you think back to the ABC method, there's actually a point in time where the polynomial in front of you has 4 items. And hopefully you're remembering that when there were 4 items sitting there, you grouped them into pairs and looked for the greatest common factor. And when you looked for the greatest common factor, you hoped that your parenthesis parts would be the same, so you could group those greatest common factors together. That's actually called factoring by grouping. So we're going to go through that process here and hope that our parenthesis parts become the same. So here, if we look at x cubed and 3x squared, all I notice is that we can factor out a 1 and we can factor out an x squared because that's all that they have in common. So here I factor out a 1 and an x squared, and I end up with 1x on the inside plus 3. And then my goal here with this next part is to get the same parenthesis piece. And I notice that if I factor out a 5, I get the same parenthesis piece. And so from here I know that because I have these same parenthesis pieces, I can group those greatest common factors that I pulled out in front together and say both 1x squared and positive 5 are being multiplied by x plus 3. This is factoring by grouping. You've factored by grouping together those greatest common factors that are being multiplied by the same parenthesis piece. So let's take a look at 2 more examples that use factoring by grouping. So here I notice I have 4 terms, 1, 2, 3, 4, and as a result I know that factoring by grouping would be a great strategy. So I group them into pairs of 2 and I factor out the greatest common factor. And with this first one I notice that the greatest common factor is 1a squared. So I factor out a 1a squared and I end up with 1a minus 11. And then I want to get those parenthesis parts to match. So I know I need to factor out a negative 9 to turn that into a positive 1a. And luckily when I do that, the 99 becomes a negative 11. So here I notice that I have matching parenthesis parts. So I can group these out in front together. So we have 1a squared plus a negative 9 times 1a minus 11. So that is the factoring by grouping piece. And for today, you can stop right here. You can group those together. You can say, I factored by grouping, and I stopped. What we're going to do in the next lesson is we're going to actually extend this, and we're going to eventually factor this a second time by using those perfect square strategies. We're just not going to just yet. We want to master this factoring by grouping first so we can stop right there. But in the next lesson, we will extend this a little bit further. Okay, if I look at my next example, what I notice here is I have 4 terms, so I'm going to group them into pairs. I notice the greatest common factor between the first 2 terms is a squared, or 1a squared. So I factor out a 1a squared. I'm left with 1a minus 3. I then want to get the parenthesis parts to match, so I factor out a negative 4 to make that equal 1a minus 3. Then because my parenthesis pieces match, I'm going to group 1a squared minus 4 together because they're both being multiplied by 1a minus 3. So here again we can see that we use factoring by grouping to group those items together that are being multiplied by the same parenthesis piece. And just like the previous example, this piece here that says 1a squared minus 4 can actually be factored a second time, but that's something that we'll tackle in the next lesson.